Now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, and indeed, he has the honor of being the first of our 20 co-host speakers. We're now down to 20 because we lost one this morning, unfortunately. Stan Salthe, representing the Infodynamics group, is a biologist by training who taught at the City University of New York for many years, published a very distinguished book in developmental biology, has become increasingly interdisciplinary, a major feat for a biologist, and in his retirement, it embraces in his interests system sciences, information theory, thermodynamics, semiotics, and natural science. And he describes himself as a person who is attempting to integrate and reinvigorate the philosophy of nature from all of those perspectives combined. A challenging undertaking. He's the author of a number of books, including this book on developmental biology. I welcome the Infodynamics group and Stan Salthe.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, infodynamics is really means information dynamics, okay? And what I'm doing today is reviewing primarily what the kinds of things that our group think we have done. I have my own spin on it, which creeps in, but I sort of think of this more as a review. So I like to read the paper because I don't want to leave anything out, you know. So, okay. My definition of infodynamics is the study of the accumulation of informational constraints as degrees of freedom during the development of not organisms, but dissipative structures. I believe in infodynamics we try and generalize away from biology and into all dissipative structures, abiotic included. I equate information itself with the fixation of a constraint bearing on such a system from any source. That is, as a reduction in the degrees of freedom in available informational constraints. The general developmental sequence would be A, nothing, followed by B, the appearance of informational constraints, symmetries, or available degrees of freedom, followed by C, the generation of information itself by way of breaking the symmetries and the reduction of degrees of freedom. In this paper, I use Shannon's H, which everybody hates now. That is information capacity or informational entropy, representing variety and uncertainty as a vicar for information itself, since there is as yet no general definition of information independent of H that works for all kinds of systems. I'm trying to generalize here. And as well, because H, in fact, is the thing we've been using in the infodynamics group to get some results or some viewpoints. I do agree that it is time now to begin branching out to other constructions of information. I'm open to it, but here I'm reviewing. Other things being equal then, the more informational constraints that are present, the more behavioral variety could be generated by reducing the degrees of freedom they represent in different ways. For example, the more genes there are, the more cell types or species with different behaviors there could be, the more species, the more ecological interactions. These cases I take be more or less isomorphic with the statement that the larger a lexicon is, the more message uncertainty is possible. Even though the fixation of informational constraints results in routinely reining in possible behaviors, periodic adaptive needs and pathological situations can release some of them again, so that information is always potential information entropy. So maximum H is proportional to or set by the number of informational constraints bearing on a system. In the context of H, information itself then can be defined as those fixed constraints that hold a system away from informational equilibrium, where every configuration the system could potentially take, given the kind of system it is, would be accessible over the natural period of that system's behavior. Since H is a statistic, we have to keep some things in mind. First, the natural period of a system's behavior, based on its system-level scale, and analogous to relaxation time in equilibrating systems, is required to be known so as to obtain conditions for observing permutations of behavioral variety. And also, in order for the probability distribution to sum to unity, H must be based on an external observer's categories. That is, only behaviors of consequence to an observer are identified as possible. The observer is classifying the behavior. So, infodynamics recognizes the need to identify from semiotics a system of interpretants that would be using or detecting the information potentially held in various configurations. For the most part, so far, interpretation has been held to be the province of an external observer, as I say. Internalist approaches, however, very new, becoming liminal on the horizon, would be, involving semiotics and so on, could be taking, could make that problematic. So only a constrained system could be conceived as having a potential information equilibrium, including in that many pathological configurations as well, which its routine variety will be holding a system away from. Again, only a constrained situation could be conceived, in fact, to be a system. Looking now at system change, I think I'll just leave that other one on. I define development operationally as predictable directional change, implying that these changes are constitutive for the kind of system involved. During its development, a material system exchanges a primal relative vagueness for degrees of freedom, and then exchanges these for increasingly definite embodiment. So, a developing system changes generally in such a way that it can inhabit increasing numbers of distinct configurations. That is, its development generates H because it is both acquiring new informational constraints and reducing. Quantitatively, maximum behavioral variety always increases in a developing system simply by way of system growth, which adds informational constraints, potential informational constraints. The expected shape of the increase against age would be roughly hyperbolic, reflecting material constraints against unlimited numbers of configurations, a law of diminishing returns, if you like. The amount of fixed information, the difference between the two curves here is entrained to a similar shape. On the asymptote, the system becomes senescent from information overload, imposed again by limited configurational resources, if it's a material system, of course. The main result of this overload is system inflexibility. Some of the new information just goes to reinforce system habits, imposing rigidity and restricting the variety requisite for adaptability. This eliminates especially configurations that might have been adaptive to rarer perturbations. But also some of the new information that keeps being loaded in the senescent system imposes lags in routine information flow by insinuating alternative pathways, and this results in interfering with existing functions by slowing down internal communications and behavioral reactions. Now, empirically, H increases with physical entropy, because, as understood in Big Bang cosmology, the appearance and subsequent clumping of matter can be seen to result from an increasingly intense search for thermodynamic equilibrium as the system expands. A necessary increase in H can be derived as a result of the second law of thermodynamics as follows. Material configurations, the results of fixed informational constraints, facilitate energy gradient degradation and therefore external physical entropy production by mediating, generally speaking, by mediating a switch from frictional conduction to of heat to rapid convection. So, variety of configurations, for example, biodiversity, connected as that is to ecological niche diversity, serves the second law. The more kinds of species there are is brought about by dispersed mutants, competitive exclusion, character displacement, things like that. The larger the variety of energy gradients being degraded, and consequently the faster would physical entropy be produced in any given locale. Developmental increases in routine functional behaviors in organisms also correlate with increased external physical entropy production. And both here and in ecosystems, increases in these variables slow down in a similar pattern, more or less as shown there, after senescence sets in. So, roughly, the more fixed informational constraints, the more entropy may be produced. And so development may also be viewed as being governed in this sense by the second law, until the point of information overload, after which nevertheless increases in H continue to occur, but at reduced rates. Summing up this argument, increases in informational constraints, as in development, allow for a greater variety of system behaviors, H, enabled by more fixed constraints, and these behaviors allow more opportunities for physical entropy production. Therefore, the second law can be seen to indirectly elicit increases in H as well. Physical entropy production and informational entropy are linked in developing systems. It's not just because their equations are isomorphic or whatever. I believe, and a lot of infodynamics folks believe, that there's something deep there. It may not be this. I think it's this. An infodynamic postulate derived from these results is informational entropy or information carrying capacity must increase in expanding growing systems. Taking the internalist approach for a moment, there's also reason to believe that for any behaving material system, H, as confronted externally from its environment, must tend to increase, because any of a system's behaviors that succeed in reducing local uncertainty for the system will cause an external chain of events, ultimately giving rise to increases in the uncertainty the system may meet later on from the more global surroundings. The result will be that the environmental uncertainty that a system must deal with will never decrease globally, delivering, I think, from an internalist point of view, a purely informational model of the second law. We might note here that from the point of view of a system rather than an external observer, the information actually used within a system is most not likely not the same as that observed externally. In this context, we could note Bateson's definition of information, I think it was Bateson, I may go back beyond him, as a difference that makes a difference. This connects with information as carrying potential surprise. What this means here is that only informational constraints fixed differently from a system's own version will potentially have meaning for it. That means, among other things, that the information used by a system would not be that characterizes it as a system for an external observer. This information that characterizes a system as that kind of system, John Collier has called N-formation. Not information, but N-formation. The information that's used by a system, however, different from that, John Collier has dubbed entropy rather than entropy. And you can see on the diagram where, why that is. My interpretation of N formation is that it is, for the most part, derived from environmental affordances, which generate a system's informational constraints. A system is a part of its environment, which has made a place for it among its own configurations and allows it to grow into the world. As it grows, a system acquires further entropic information as marks of its adventures, when some of its still open degrees of freedom get reduced, increasing its internal information tally. Some of this acquired information would be incorporated into its N formation as well during a system's self-organization as it individuates, diverging in various ways from the standard for its type, which was set originally by the environment. We might dwell for a moment on the sense of information as a difference or distinction. For example, genetic information is always associated with some phenotypic difference. No difference, no gene, even if you got DNA. This raises the theoretical problem of similarity, which you don't see raised often. In the informational world of distinctions, similarity is just absence of a difference. This covertly, it seems to me, assumes that all the world was at one time a uniform whole and has subsequently differentiated. In general, and from the point of view of natural philosophy, which is now my own discourse, this is not problematic, I think. But there are some troubling facts. For example, the reality of convergent evolution in biological systems and the similarities in whole vegetations of far-flung biomes, not to mention fluid vortices and tree forms at large everywhere in the world. These appear to be similarities not devolving from common ancestral information passed on locally, as in the genetic system. Some of us have postulated structural attractors to explain such phenomena. In this case, the material commonality might go back before the origin of life, to the establishment of the laws of matter, those that dictate, for example, the forms of trees and vortices. Structures in this view are generally present information constraints that were partially reduced relatively early in the history of the universe, acting as weak forces or weak attractors, such that when a material system appears that supplies enough further information reduced out of its own associated constraints, the form of the structure, say a tree or a vortex, is accessed because the total of local degrees of freedom have been reduced so far as to make the form emerge from immanence to actuality. Structures are immanent forms. So, let's see. I'll have to skip some things for 5 minutes. So let me say, entropy, or historical information, feeds upon itself quantitatively by way of mutations of all kinds, which generate more of it as a result of the frictional materiality of the world, and which can be taken once again to be called for by the second law of thermodynamics, in the sense that any informational configuration will tend to be eroded or modified by energy transactions in its vicinity. The more information there is, the more variety could be produced from its mutations, generating more possible deviations from routine behavior. But as a system senesces, its own material inertia will enlist more and more of these mutations into its increasingly overdetermined behavior as tributaries. There is, therefore, a widening gap between the maximum variety possible for system behavior, H max, based on possible permutations of a system's behavioral configurations, and the average actual variety demonstrated by a system as it continues to endure. So, let's see. I was going to talk about emergence. I think there's not time for emergence. You can get to emergence from these considerations. And what happens there is that I think not only do you need the system's information that's given to it by its environment, but you also need further boundary condition informational constraints in order to allow an emergence to occur. But clearly, we don't have time to go into that. So I guess we'll rush ahead. That okay, Peter?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
One question. How we can define
For Brian.
your
By the way, we're going to have a
Not a
meeting
moment
later.
too soon.
We're going to have a meeting later.
principal question? Because without this I cannot understand your speech.
Oh, well,
How we can define entropy of constraint to make this from Shannon method? Entropy of constraint.
well,
What is formally? How we can formally define?
we would have to take more time than we have here. Why don't you come to our meeting later? It's listed, and you can ask the question. And we have several people that might like to deal with that question. So I don't think I want to do it now.